At 6:04 a.m., my phone started ringing like a fire alarm in an empty house. By 6:07, 10 properties legally no longer belonged to my daughters. Christmas morning was supposed to smell like cinnamon rolls and fresh pine, not silence. I had set the table for 11 the night before, polished silverware, folded linen napkins, even placed name cards out of habit though they hadn't lived here in years. 10 chairs sat untouched under the warm glow of the chandelier. At 8:12 p.m., my family group chat lit up. A photo loaded slowly, snow falling over aspen, champagne glasses raised, designer coats, perfect smiles. The caption read, "We deserve better." I stared at that sentence longer than I should have. Better than what? The 9,000 square foot home they grew up in? The college tuition paid in full? The starter houses I gifted each of them at 25? I didn't respond. I washed the dishes alone, dried each plate carefully, and turned off the Christmas lights one by one. The house felt larger without their voices, almost echoing. Around 1:47 a.m., I walked into my study, opened the wall safe behind a framed photo from 1998, and pulled out a leather binder most of them never knew existed. 3 years ago, my attorney insisted on adding a clause to the Whitmore family trust. Just in case, he'd said. I didn't believe I would ever need it. It was called a familial severance clause. Legal language. Clean. Precise. It didn't punish. It corrected ownership. Every property I'd given them had been structured through a revocable trust. Every monthly $25,000 deposit labeled as allowance was technically a discretionary distribution. They saw gifts. I saw stewardship. I signed the activation page at 2:13 a.m., my pen steady, my breathing even. No anger. No raised voice. Just ink on paper. By dawn, asset reversion protocols were in motion. Titles transferred back under the master trust. Lines of credit tied to those properties froze automatically. Recurring deposits were halted. At 6:04 a.m., my phone lit up with Catherine's name first. Then Emily. Then 3 at once. Voicemails stacked up before I even poured my coffee. Dad, something's wrong with the house. My account says 0. The bank says the trust changed. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the winter sun stretch across the lawn, the same lawn where they used to build snowmen measured in feet, not inches. For decades, I believed providing was the same as parenting. I thought stability guaranteed loyalty. But somewhere between their first mortgages and their first luxury SUVs, gratitude turned into expectation. Last night they left me at an empty table. This morning they woke up to empty accounts. Christmas teaches children about receiving. This one taught my daughters about ownership. The calls kept coming, but I let them ring. I have learned over 72 years that urgency sounds louder than truth. By 6:32 a.m., there were 12 missed calls and a string of messages that shifted from confusion to accusation. Catherine wrote first, her words clipped and sharp. She said the bank told her the property title had reverted to the Whitmore family trust. She said there must be a mistake. There was no mistake. At 7:05 a.m., Emily sent a screenshot of her checking account. The balance showed $0.00 where $25,000 had appeared on the first of every month for nearly a decade. She asked if the system had been hacked. I took a slow sip of coffee and watched frost melt off the back patio railing. The system had not been hacked. The system had finally worked the way it was designed to. 3 years ago, when my attorney suggested restructuring the assets, I remember feeling insulted. He asked me a simple question across a polished oak desk in his downtown office. What happens if they stop seeing you as family and start seeing you as funding? I laughed back then. I told him my daughters were different. I told him loyalty could not be measured in dollars. He did not argue. He simply drafted language. Revocable trust. Conditional distributions. Property held in stewardship rather than outright ownership. At the time, I signed the documents because I believed I would never need them. Not because I planned to use them. I funded each trust with a house value between $800,000 and $1.2 million depending on the market. I covered property taxes, insurance, maintenance. I wired $25,000 on the first day of every month without fail. I told myself I was giving them freedom. Freedom to build businesses. Freedom to raise families without financial strain. Somewhere along the way, freedom turned into expectation. Expectation hardened into entitlement. Last Thanksgiving, Catherine raised a glass in this same dining room and said, "To Dad, who always pays." Everyone laughed. I laughed too. But I noticed none of them corrected her. None of them said, "To Dad, who built." By 8:10 a.m., the messages changed tone. Now they were demanding explanations. Claire asked how I could do this right after Christmas. Madison said the timing was cruel. Cruel. I stood in the quiet kitchen and looked at the untouched gingerbread house on the counter. They had left me alone 12 hours earlier without a second thought. No one asked if I would mind spending Christmas by myself. No one asked if I would be all right. They assumed I would always be there. Always open. Always paying. At 8:43 a.m., Catherine finally left a voicemail instead of a text. Her voice was shaking. "Dad, you cannot just take everything back. That is not fair." I replayed that sentence once. Then I set the phone face down again. Fair is a word people use when they forget who signed the papers. I did not take anything back. I simply stopped pretending it was ever fully theirs. By mid-morning the house phone started ringing, not just my cell. The landline number only my children used when something felt serious. I let it ring twice before answering. Catherine did not say hello. She went straight to accusation. She said I was humiliating them. She said her mortgage company had called, informing her that the title holder of record had changed overnight, and that future payments would be reviewed under the new ownership. I listened without interrupting. When she paused to breathe, I asked one question. "Did you read the trust agreement when you signed it at 25? Silence does not need to be loud to say something. She finally admitted she trusted me. That word again. Trusted. As if trust meant permanent access. As if love required blind signatures. I reminded her that every house had been structured under stewardship. She responded that no father would ever enforce something like that. I almost smiled at the predictability of it. By 10:15 a.m., 3 of them were on a group call, their voices overlapping, each trying to outpace the other. Madison said her husband was furious. Claire said her credit line was frozen and that contractors were scheduled to renovate the kitchen next week. Emily asked how she was supposed to maintain her lifestyle if the monthly transfer stopped. Lifestyle. I looked around my quiet kitchen, at the coffee mug I had owned for 15 years, at the same hardwood floors that had not changed since their childhood. I built a lifestyle from concrete and long hours. I did not inherit one. I explained calmly that nothing had been taken. The properties were reverting to the central trust, which I remained the sole trustee of. The distributions had been discretionary, not guaranteed income. There was a difference between support and obligation. They heard only the absence of money. Around noon, I drove downtown to my attorney's office. Not because I doubted the legality, but because I value documentation over emotion. He reviewed the activation paperwork and confirmed what I already knew. The clause had been properly executed. Notice letters would be delivered formally within 48 hours. Everything was clean. Orderly. Within the law. As I stepped back into the cold December air, my phone vibrated again. This time it was Hannah, one of the quieter ones. She did not yell. She asked softly if this was permanent. I told her it depended. On what, she asked? On whether they understood the difference between being provided for and being entitled. There was a long pause before she whispered that maybe they had gone too far. I did not rush to comfort her. Accountability does not need theatrics. It needs clarity. By late afternoon, the anger had shifted into negotiation. They wanted to meet. They wanted to talk in person. I agreed to nothing. I told them I would consider a family meeting after the holidays. Christmas had passed. Reflection had not. As evening settled over the house again, I turned the tree lights back on. The same tree. The same ornaments. The difference was not the room. The difference was understanding. For the first time in years, the silence did not feel like abandonment. It felt like control returned to its rightful place. The next morning arrived quieter than the one before, but the quiet felt different, heavier with consequence. At 7:30 a.m., a black sedan pulled into my driveway without notice. I knew before I opened the curtains who it would be. Catherine stepped out first, wrapped in a wool coat that probably cost more than my first monthly mortgage payment back in 1984. Behind her, Claire and Madison followed, their expressions tight, controlled, rehearsed. They had come not as daughters returning home, but as negotiators approaching a boardroom. I opened the front door before they rang the bell. No one hugged. No one asked how I slept. Catherine walked in as if she still owned a key. She said they needed to resolve this misunderstanding. I gestured toward the dining table where 12 hours earlier 10 chairs had been empty. Now only 4 were filled. Madison spoke first, saying the clause was extreme, that families make mistakes, that Christmas was not meant to become a legal event. I listened without raising my voice. When she finished, I asked a simple question. When you left for Aspen, did any of you think about how this house would feel with 10 empty seats? They exchanged glances, not answers. Claire shifted the conversation to practical matters. She explained that contractors had already begun renovations on her property, and that reversing ownership created complications. Complications. I reminded her that the house was never titled solely in her name. It had always been held in trust. She said that was a technicality. I corrected her gently. Technicalities are what separate assets from assumptions. The room fell still. Catherine finally dropped the corporate tone. She said I was punishing them. I shook my head. No. I am correcting the structure. There is a difference between retaliation and recalibration. I explained that the trust was designed to protect the family legacy, not finance lifestyle inflation. The monthly distributions were intended as support, while they built something of their own. Instead, they built dependencies. Madison's voice softened. She asked what it would take to restore things to the way they were. That question told me more than any apology could. They did not ask how to repair the relationship. They asked how to restore the transfers. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the bare oak trees lining the driveway. When I turned back, I spoke slowly so there would be no confusion. The properties remain under trust management. The distributions are suspended indefinitely. If you wish to demonstrate responsibility, we can discuss performance-based support in the future. Catherine frowned at the word performance. She said families should not operate like corporations. I met her eyes evenly. Families should not treat fathers like banks. Silence settled over the table again, this time. Thicker, more reflective. For a moment I saw the young women they used to be, sitting in these same chairs asking for help with homework, trusting that I would guide them. Guidance sometimes feels uncomfortable when it replaces convenience. They left less confidently than they arrived. No one slammed a door. No one made threats. They simply walked out into the cold morning air, uncertain for the first time in years. I closed the door gently behind them and returned to the dining room. The chairs were still in place. The difference now was understanding. Support is a gift. Ownership is earned. And legacy does not belong to those who forget where it came from. That evening the house felt different again, not quieter, but clearer. For years I mistook presence for connection. 10 cars in the driveway meant family. 10 credit cards on my account meant support. But numbers can create illusions if you do not look beneath them. Around 6 p.m., as the sky faded into a pale winter blue, my phone vibrated with a message from Hannah. Not a demand this time. Not a complaint. Just a simple sentence. Can I come by alone? I did not answer immediately. I finished the paperwork on my desk first, reviewing quarterly reports from the commercial properties downtown, reminding myself that structure is what sustains stability. When I finally replied, I wrote, "You may." She arrived 20 minutes later in her own car, not a driver, not a rideshare. She stepped inside without the polished confidence her sisters carried earlier. She looked around the living room, at the tree still glowing, at the same framed photographs from childhood. She asked if we could sit by the fireplace. I agreed. For a few minutes she said nothing. Then she admitted that Aspen had not been her idea. She said it felt easier to follow the group than to challenge it. Easier to assume I would understand. I asked her what she thought understanding meant. She hesitated. Finally she said it meant unconditional support. I nodded slowly. Support is not the same as silence, I told her. And unconditional does not mean unexamined. She looked down at her hands and said she had not realized how dependent she had become on the monthly transfer. She said she had planned her entire budget around it, including vacations and private school tuition for her son. I did not criticize her. I simply explained that a distribution from a trust is a privilege extended by the trustee, not a paycheck guaranteed by an employer. There is dignity in earning. There is danger in assuming. She asked whether the properties would ever return to them outright. I told her ownership is not a gift one unwraps. It is a responsibility one demonstrates readiness for. That answer did not satisfy her fully, but it did not anger her either. Before she left, she apologized for leaving on Christmas. Not dramatically. Not for effect. Quietly. I accepted the apology without theatrics. After she drove away, I sat back in the same chair and reflected on what had truly shifted. The money was never the real issue. The houses were not the core problem. The problem was narrative. They had begun to see themselves as beneficiaries of a system that existed independent of my effort. As if wealth were a natural resource rather than a constructed one. I built my first property by driving to construction sites at 5 a.m, measuring lumber by the foot, negotiating loans with interest rates that would make them uncomfortable today. Nothing about that process was automatic. Nothing about it was guaranteed. If legacy means anything, it means understanding the foundation beneath the comfort. I do not know how each of my daughters will respond in the weeks ahead. Some may resent me. Some may adapt. But the structure remains intact. The trust is secure. The properties are protected. And for the first time in a long time, the difference between being loved and being funded is no longer blurred. Control was never about domination. It was about clarity. And clarity, once restored, does not need to raise its voice. The following week unfolded with a precision none of them expected. Notices were delivered formally, not dramatically. Certified envelopes arrived at each property explaining the reversion of title, the suspension of discretionary distributions, and the updated structure of the Whitmore Family Trust. Everything was documented. Everything was lawful. By Thursday afternoon, I received confirmation that 3 of the homes had already begun refinancing discussions under the Trust's oversight. Efficiency does not require emotion. It requires clarity. Around 3 p.m., my office manager forwarded me an email chain from one of the banks where the family accounts had been held. Catherine had attempted to escalate the matter to a regional executive, implying fraud. The executive reviewed the trust documents and responded with a single sentence. All actions appear consistent with governing agreements. That was the moment I understood this was no longer about anger. It was about adjustment. Late that evening, Emily requested a formal meeting with my attorney present. Her message was measured, almost professional. She wrote that she would like to understand the performance-based support I had mentioned. I respected that shift in language. Not outrage. Not accusation. Inquiry. The following morning she arrived at the downtown office, not at the house. She wore a navy coat and carried a legal pad. We sat across from each other at the conference table where I had signed countless development contracts over the decades. My attorney outlined the new structure clearly. If any daughter wished to regain discretionary distributions, she would need to present a sustainable business plan or documented employment income exceeding a defined threshold. Contributions to the Family Charitable Foundation would also be required, measured not only in dollars but in hours. Stewardship over entitlement. Emily listened without interruption. When the explanation ended, she asked if this was permanent. I told her permanence depends on behavior, not emotion. Wealth can be transferred in seconds. Character takes years. She did not argue. She simply nodded slowly and said she had underestimated how structured the trust had always been. That admission mattered more than any apology. As she left, she paused at the door and said she had not realized how much of her identity was built around access rather than achievement. I watched her walk down the hallway with a different posture than before, less defensive, more reflective. That evening, I reviewed the Foundation's annual report. For years, I had quietly funded scholarships and housing initiatives without public recognition. None of my daughters had ever asked where that money originated. They assumed abundance was infinite. Now, perhaps, they would begin to understand allocation. The shift was not immediate across all 10. Some continued to send sharp messages. Some remained silent. But the pattern had changed. Conversations were no longer about what they were owed. They were about what they could demonstrate. As night settled over the city, I stood by the office window overlooking the skyline I had helped shape one building at a time. Legacy is not measured in square footage or account balances. It is measured in whether the next generation understands the weight behind the signature that made their comfort possible. For the first time since that empty dinner table, I felt the structure doing exactly what it was designed to do. Not to punish. Not to shame. But to restore proportion. And proportion, once restored, becomes the quiet foundation for everything that follows. 2 weeks after Christmas, the noise settled into something more revealing than anger. Silence from some. Structured emails from others. The first concrete shift came from Claire. She requested access to the financial literacy advisor who had once helped me structure my early developments. That request alone told me the ground beneath her had moved. We met at a small conference room in my downtown office, the same building where she used to visit as a child and spin in the leather chairs while I finalized contracts measured in millions of dollars. This time she did not spin. She asked questions. Real ones. About leverage ratios. About cash flow coverage. About why the trust separated principal from distribution. I answered without condescension. I explained how income-producing assets differ from lifestyle assets, how appreciation on paper does not equal liquidity in reality. She listened carefully, taking notes as if she were studying for an exam she had not realized she was enrolled in. Meanwhile, Madison took a different path. She called to inform me she had accepted a full-time position at a marketing firm. Not because she needed a hobby, but because she needed income independent of transfers. Her tone carried a trace of humility I had not heard in years. She did not ask for reinstatement. She asked for advice on negotiating a salary. That distinction mattered. Catherine remained resistant the longest. She framed everything as principle, as if I had violated an unspoken parental contract. I invited her to lunch at a quiet restaurant near the river, neutral ground. Over a simple meal she finally admitted that her identity had been intertwined with the perception of inherited stability. Friends assumed she was untouchable. Mortgage officers treated her differently. She liked that advantage. I told her advantage without effort becomes fragile. She asked whether I felt guilty. I told her guilt is reserved for wrongdoing, not for enforcing structure. Over time, even her tone softened. At home, the house felt less like a headquarters and more like what it had always been intended to be, a residence. I resumed small routines I had neglected for years. Morning walks measured in miles rather than conference calls. Evenings spent reviewing foundation proposals instead of monitoring family group chats. The trust reports continued to arrive weekly, each property performing steadily under centralized management. The numbers were stable. Predictable. Order restored. But the real change was intangible. Conversations with my daughters gradually shifted from demands to disclosures. Emily presented a draft proposal for a consulting firm she wanted to launch. Hannah volunteered at the foundation twice a week without being prompted. None of this happened overnight. It unfolded through discomfort, through recalibration. They began to see that access had always been conditional, not punitive. The difference between ownership and occupancy was no longer theoretical. It was lived. I do not know how history will remember this winter in our family. Perhaps as harsh. Perhaps as necessary. What I know is that wealth without boundaries breeds distortion. Boundaries without explanation breed resentment. Structure with clarity breeds growth. And for the first time in a long while, growth seemed possible again, not because I withdrew support, but because I redefined it. By early spring, the temperature outside had shifted from sharp winter air to something softer, almost forgiving. Inside the family, the climate was changing as well. The trust reports continued to arrive every Monday morning, printed on heavy paper, numbers steady and disciplined. 3 of the properties were now generating rental income under centralized management. The monthly cash flow exceeded what some of my daughters had previously received in automatic transfers. That detail was not lost on them. It demonstrated something simple and powerful: structure can outperform sentiment. Emily was the first to submit a formal proposal under the new guidelines. Her consulting firm plan was detailed, projected revenue broken down by quarter, operating expenses calculated down to the dollar. She requested a performance-based distribution contingent upon achieving specific milestones. I reviewed the document carefully, not as a father looking to reward effort, but as a trustee evaluating viability. After 2 revisions and a scheduled review with my financial advisor, I approved a limited quarterly distribution tied directly to revenue growth. It was not generosity. It was governance. When I informed her of the approval, she did not celebrate. She thanked me for the opportunity and asked what metrics would be monitored. That question told me more than any emotional apology ever could. Meanwhile, Madison had completed her first 90 days at the marketing firm. She called one evening to share that she negotiated a bonus structure tied to measurable performance indicators. Her voice carried a tone of pride I had not heard when her income came effortlessly. It was different. Earned confidence resonates differently than inherited security. Catherine remained cautious, but she, too, began to recalibrate. She requested documentation on how the Family Foundation evaluated scholarship applicants. For years she had attended the annual gala as a guest of honor. Now she asked to sit on the review committee? I agreed, but only after explaining that committee members were expected to read every application and justify each vote. 2 weeks later, she submitted written evaluations that were thoughtful and precise. I read them carefully. Beneath the former entitlement, there had always been intelligence. It simply needed friction to sharpen it. At home, the large dining table no longer symbolized absence. It represented possibility. When the daughters began visiting again, it was not to negotiate transfers but to discuss plans. The conversations were less polished, more honest. They asked about my early years in business, about the first loan I nearly defaulted on, about how I calculated risk when the margin for error was measured in inches, not miles. For the first time, they seemed curious about the foundation rather than the finish. One evening, as we cleared plates after a simple dinner, Hannah said quietly that she had been embarrassed by how easily she had equated love with allowance. No one contradicted her. No one needed to. The trust remained intact. The distributions remained conditional. But something more valuable had shifted. They no longer saw the structure as punishment. They saw it as framework. Wealth is not a constant flow of resources. It is a system designed to endure beyond personalities and seasons. And endurance requires discipline. I did not reclaim control to prove a point. I restored proportion to protect a legacy. As the days grew longer and sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors in the late afternoon, I realized the lesson had finally taken root. Support is strongest when it teaches independence. Ownership is meaningful only when it is understood. And legacy survives not through comfort, but through clarity. By late spring the air inside the house felt lighter, but clarity has a way of revealing what comfort once concealed. The trust continued operating exactly as designed, steady distributions tied to performance metrics, properties appreciating under centralized management. Yet the real measure of change was not on a spreadsheet. It was in posture. It was in tone. It was in the way my daughters entered a room. Catherine began arriving with folders instead of expectations. She presented a redevelopment proposal for one of the smaller rental units under the trust, outlining projected renovation costs down to the square foot, forecasting rental yield based on comparable listings within a 5-mile radius. I reviewed her projections carefully. They were not flawless, but they were thoughtful. For the first time, she was not asking for access. She was offering contribution. Madison called one evening to describe her first client campaign at the marketing firm. She spoke about deadlines, about accountability meetings, about the pressure of delivering measurable results. There was fatigue in her voice, but also pride. Earned income carries weight differently than transferred funds. Emily's consulting firm secured its first contract by early May. The revenue was modest, but legitimate. When she requested her quarterly distribution under the performance clause, she attached documentation without being prompted. Transparency had replaced assumption. Even Claire, who once focused solely on lifestyle upgrades, submitted a cost-efficiency analysis on the property she once occupied, suggesting operational improvements that would increase net operating income by 3% annually. 3% may not sound dramatic to some, but compounded over years it becomes significant. That is how legacy grows. Incrementally. Deliberately. Hannah continued volunteering at the foundation, logging hours without announcing them in the family group chat. One afternoon she joined me at a scholarship review session. She read every applicant profile carefully, pausing over essays written by students who described working part-time jobs to support their families. Afterward she said quietly that she had never understood how fragile opportunity could be for someone without a safety net. I did not lecture. I simply nodded. Understanding born from exposure lasts longer than understanding born from instruction. The family dinners resumed gradually. Not grand affairs. Simple meals. Conversation shifted from vacation plans to business models, from entitlement to execution. There were still moments of tension. Growth rarely unfolds without friction. But the tension now felt productive rather than corrosive. 1. Evening. As we sat around the same table that had once stood empty, Catherine raised a glass again. This time she said, "To structure." It was a subtle acknowledgement, but it carried weight. I did not correct her wording. Structure is what had always protected this family, even when they mistook it for restriction. The properties remained under trust oversight. The distributions remained conditional. Nothing reverted to its previous form. And yet the atmosphere was no longer adversarial. It was disciplined. Legacy is not preserved by generosity alone. It is preserved by boundaries that outlast emotion. When I look at my daughters now, I do not see beneficiaries waiting for the next transfer. I see adults navigating consequence, recalibrating ambition, rediscovering capability. The winter that began with absence has transitioned into a season of accountability. And accountability, once embraced, becomes the quiet engine behind every enduring system. Summer arrived without announcement, the way real change often does. No headlines. No dramatic gestures. Just heat settling over the city and a rhythm that felt earned rather than assumed. The trust continued operating with disciplined precision, quarterly reviews replacing emotional conversations. What had once been automatic was now deliberate. Emily's consulting firm closed its second contract in June. Revenue projections were adjusted upward by 8%, modest but sustainable. When she submitted her updated financials for review, she included a contingency plan in case of market contraction. That detail mattered. It signaled foresight rather than reliance. Madison received her first performance bonus at the marketing firm. She deposited it without commentary, but later called to say she finally understood what it meant to calculate taxes on income she had personally generated. There was a different kind of respect in her voice, not toward me, but toward the process itself. Claire's operational improvements on the rental property resulted in a measurable increase in net operating income. 3% compounded over 12 months translated into real growth. She asked if the trust would consider matching reinvestment funds if she continued to improve performance metrics. I approved a conditional match. Not as a reward but as leverage. Hannah remained the most consistent presence at the foundation. She helped evaluate applicants for summer scholarships, reviewing transcripts, reading personal statements, calculating budget gaps down to the dollar. One evening she stayed late and asked me why I never told them how close I had come to losing everything in my early 40s when interest rates spiked and one development stalled. I told her because fear does not build resilience unless it is faced directly. They had never needed to face it before. Now they were beginning to. Catherine surprised me most of all. She requested a formal apprenticeship under the Trust's property management arm. Not symbolic involvement. Real oversight. Site visits measured in miles driven, not minutes discussed. Tenant meetings. Vendor negotiations. By July she had completed her first independent lease agreement without error. When she handed me the finalized document for review, her signature was firm, steady. It reminded me of my own decades earlier. The house itself felt different that summer. Not smaller, not larger. Balanced. Dinners were no longer showcases of comfort but exchanges of ideas. They debated cash flow strategies instead of vacation itineraries. They asked about depreciation schedules, about long-term capital gains implications, about the difference between appreciation and liquidity. I answered every question patiently. Structure had replaced assumption. The trust remained intact. The properties remained centralized. The distributions remained conditional. Nothing returned to the effortless pattern it once followed. And that was the point. Legacy is not about restoring what was comfortable. It is about strengthening what will endure. When I sit now at the same dining table that once stood empty, I no longer measure presence by headcount. I measure it by contribution. Wealth is sustained not by generosity alone, but by discipline shared across generations. What began as absence evolved into accountability. What felt like loss revealed foundation. And foundation, once understood, becomes the quiet architecture of everything that follows. By late August, the rhythm of the family had settled into something steady enough to measure. Not comfort, not tension. Discipline. The Trust's third-quarter report reflected growth across all managed properties, occupancy rates holding above 94%, operating costs reduced by strategic renegotiations Catherine had helped coordinate. She now understood the difference between collecting rent and managing assets. One afternoon she returned from a site visit with dust on her shoes and a folder of maintenance proposals marked in red ink. She spoke about deferred expenses and long-term capital improvements, about how neglect in small increments compounds into structural risk. I listened carefully. She was no longer speaking like someone who expected insulation from consequence. She was speaking like someone who understood it. Emily's consulting firm secured a mid-sized corporate client that required detailed compliance oversight. She asked to review sections of the original trust agreement again, this time not out of suspicion but curiosity. She wanted to understand how risk had been mitigated from the beginning. We sat in the study, documents spread across the desk, and I explained how liability shielding, tiered ownership, and staggered distributions protect both assets and relationships. She nodded, not intimidated, but engaged. Madison's marketing campaigns produced measurable returns for her employer, and she negotiated a higher base salary supported by performance data. When she mentioned it during dinner, it was not framed as an achievement deserving reward from me. It was framed as evidence of capability. That shift mattered more than any transfer ever could. Claire continued refining operational strategies for the rental portfolio. She proposed a tenant retention program that reduced vacancy turnover by extending lease incentives for reliable renters. The program increased net operating income by another 2%. She presented the results at the quarterly family review meeting we now held in the downtown conference room. 10 chairs were filled. Not because they were entitled to be there, but because they contributed. Hannah expanded her involvement with the foundation, proposing a mentorship initiative pairing scholarship recipients with professionals in their fields of interest. She asked if the trust would allocate a small portion of annual gains to seed the program. I approved it after reviewing the projected impact. Allocation, when grounded in purpose, strengthens legacy. The house itself felt less like a monument, and more like a gathering place anchored by intention. Conversations revolved around projections, risk assessments, philanthropy, and long-term strategy. There were still moments of disagreement, but the tone had changed. Disagreements were now analytical rather than emotional. No one referenced what had been taken. They referenced what could be built. As summer leaned toward autumn, I found myself reflecting not on the shock of that winter morning, but on the clarity that followed. Wealth without expectation management erodes relationships. Boundaries without explanation breed resentment. But structure applied consistently creates alignment. My daughters no longer saw the trust as a barrier. They saw it as architecture. And architecture, when respected, supports weight without collapsing under it. The transformation was not perfect. Growth rarely is. But it was measurable. It was tangible. And it was earned. I did not withdraw support to diminish them. I enforced structure to elevate them. And elevation, once experienced through effort, becomes self-sustaining. Autumn arrived with a steadier light, the kind that stretches long across hardwood floors and exposes details without harshness. The fourth quarter review meeting felt different from the ones earlier in the year. Not because the numbers were dramatic, but because the posture around the table had changed permanently. The trust portfolio had grown by a measurable margin, occupancy rates holding firm, operating expenses controlled, capital reserves strengthened. Catherine presented a long-term capital improvement plan projecting 5-year appreciation based on disciplined reinvestment. She spoke in terms of durability rather than expansion. That distinction mattered. Emily's consulting firm closed its third contract and demonstrated consistent revenue growth over 2 consecutive quarters. Under the performance clause, her distribution adjusted upwards slightly, not as a reward for ambition, but as alignment with measurable achievement. She accepted the adjustment with professionalism rather than celebration. Madison introduced a proposal to create a branding strategy for the foundation itself, focusing on measurable impact rather than gala visibility. She explained that narrative matters when tied to transparency. Claire's retention program showed tangible results, vacancy rates decreasing another fraction, maintenance forecasting becoming more predictive. She discussed depreciation schedules with clarity that once would have bored her. Now it energized her. Hannah presented the first annual report for the mentorship initiative, documenting participant outcomes, internship placements, and academic retention percentages. Her voice carried quiet confidence, not performance, but purpose. As I listened to each of them, I realized something subtle yet profound. They were no longer speaking to secure access. They were speaking to strengthen a system. The trust remained intact, centralized, conditional. The structure had not softened. It had simply been understood. After the meeting ended, we remained seated longer than usual. No one rushed for an exit. Catherine looked around the table and acknowledged that the disruption months earlier had forced growth none of them would have chosen voluntarily. There was no defensiveness in her tone. Only recognition. I responded calmly that growth rarely arrives through comfort. It arrives through recalibration. The house that once felt cavernous in its silence now felt balanced in its activity. Family dinners resumed not as showcases of wealth, but as working sessions interwoven with shared meals. They asked about long-term succession planning, about governance beyond my lifetime. That question carried weight. I explained that the trust was designed to endure through structured oversight, rotating trusteeship, and transparent reporting. Legacy is not sustained by inheritance alone. It is sustained by process. As the evening light dimmed outside the windows, I considered how easily things might have deteriorated had structure remained unspoken. Wealth without clarity fractures families. Clarity without consistency loses authority. But clarity reinforced through action becomes culture. My daughters were no longer beneficiaries waiting for deposits. They were stewards in training, accountable to metrics, aware of consequence, conscious of contribution. The season that began with absence had evolved into alignment. Not perfect. Not effortless. But grounded. And grounded systems endure beyond personality, beyond emotion, beyond any single winter night that once exposed the gap between expectation and ownership. Structure did not diminish love. It clarified it. And clarity, once internalized, becomes the quiet inheritance no document alone can guarantee. Winter returned quietly, almost respectfully, as if aware of what it had once exposed. The house was decorated again, lights threaded carefully along the staircase, the same ornaments placed on the tree with deliberate hands. But this year the preparation felt different. Not expectant. Grounded. The Trust's annual report sat on my desk, its pages reflecting steady growth, disciplined reinvestment, and measurable contribution from every branch of the family. Catherine had completed her first full year overseeing operational improvements within the property portfolio. Vacancy rates were down, maintenance forecasting more accurate than ever. She no longer spoke about ownership in abstract terms. She spoke about stewardship, about protecting margins, about safeguarding reserves for downturn cycles that inevitably arrive. Emily's consulting firm had matured into a sustainable enterprise, not explosive, but resilient. She requested no adjustment to her distribution this quarter, choosing instead to retain earnings for reinvestment. That decision required no applause. It required maturity. Madison's marketing strategies elevated the Foundation's transparency initiatives, leading to a measurable increase in donor engagement without inflating administrative costs. Claire finalized a long-term capital improvement roadmap extending 5 years into the future, incorporating depreciation planning and contingency allocations for market fluctuations. Hannah's mentorship program expanded beyond initial projections, pairing scholarship recipients with industry professionals across multiple cities. Each initiative reflected something more significant than financial return. It reflected alignment. On Christmas Eve, they arrived early, not because tradition demanded it, but because presence now carried intention. 10 chairs were filled again, but the energy was no longer casual entitlement. It was conscious participation. During dinner, conversation shifted naturally between personal milestones and quarterly metrics, between family stories and strategic planning. At one point Catherine raised a glass, not theatrically, but sincerely. She did not thank me for funding. She thanked the structure that had forced them to grow. I met her eyes steadily and nodded. The trust remained intact. The clauses remained enforceable. Nothing reverted to effortless access. Yet nothing felt adversarial. What began as disruption had evolved into discipline shared across generations. After dinner, as the dishes were cleared and the lights dimmed, I stood for a moment at the head of the table, not as a benefactor, but as a steward watching the system function independently. Legacy is not secured by generosity alone. It is secured by boundaries that teach responsibility. Love does not weaken under structure. It strengthens when expectation aligns with contribution. The winter that once revealed absence now framed presence differently. Not as a guarantee. As a choice. My daughters no longer viewed the trust as something to inherit. They viewed it as something to uphold. And that distinction, quiet and uncelebrated, marked the true transfer of wealth. Not dollars. Not property. Understanding. When the final lights were switched off and the house settled into silence, it no longer felt empty. It felt balanced. Structure had not divided us. It had defined us. And definition, once accepted, becomes the foundation upon which enduring families are built.